In 2004, Stencil Shadows were seen as a thing far harder on hardware than even path tracing is today. Many games desired this technology, but few were willing to make the complete sacrifice and embrace slow, linear gameplay with narrow levels as the conceit for it. Severance Blade of Darkness was the first to use this technology, followed soon by fully stencil-lit integrations in Deus Ex Invisible War, released on December 2nd of 2003, and in 2004, Thief, Deadly Shadows, and Doom 3 also embraced this technology. This technology becoming a core gameplay implement because of its heavy cost rather than simply a way to light the scene. Being scrapped in games such as Halo 2 due to its high cost, much had to be sacrificed for this technology. Of the 18 titles shipped with Stencil Shadows, 5 used IdTech 4, 5 used the Lilith engine, and 3 Starbreeze, the engine that first brought Stencil Shadows into gaming in the first place. This highly concentrated mass made it so the future of technology was controlled by only 3 companies. And after Fear 3, the Fear series and Stencil Shadows died alongside each other, being replaced with Screen Space Shadows, or SSR, then Ray Tracing, then Path Tracing. Though I do not see these as upgrades, quite the opposite in fact. Stencil Shadows as a technology were often limited by the hardware of their day, though today in their full glory have a beauty that almost none can see. Still in their infancy, with many of the problems being addressed by fans of the games in later years, and few that almost certainly would have been if the technology was allowed to prosper, was taken out to pasture in its earliest state. Even despite this, it produces a beauty that no other lighting method, no matter how expensive, has been able to capture to this day. When we look at lighting, we can't just look at our modern path tracing and say that looks fantastic. And it can, but we have to look at what came before it. This is a game, Doom 3, released in 2004, and it was only the 4th most demanding game released in 2004. It wasn't even the highest in terms of system requirements. And this game, to this day, looks fantastic. Even people who hate this game don't deny how good it looks. These lights come in and they accentuate the scene with full dynamicism, letting you really feel like you're in the experience. It's truly a game visually unlike anything I've ever played. But this game, you'd ask, well, how does it run? On this same GPU, this game frequently goes over 500 FPS. But we have modern technology. Surely our modern games will look fantastic. I present to you NVIDIA's Showcase, a showcase used for 6 years now, developed by some of the best graphical engineers that this world has to offer. Cyberpunk 2077. No, that's how it runs. Yep. Hold on, it'll get there. Yep, just give it a second. Oh. Shit. To give this game the chance that I think it should get, it should be given its maximum settings and used and evaluated for the technology it has. I will not talk about the game because this is not a video about the game. This is a video about the lighting. And from what we can see in the lighting, it's pretty shit. When the lighting comes, you can get occasional realistic reflections, but it doesn't look like a reflection. It looks like a camera pointed at the scene projecting upwards, which older games actually did to simulate dynamic lighting, a much more effective tactic that can run at exponentially higher FPS, a technique which was all but thrown away when RTX came on the scene. and is only getting worse in the era of path tracing. You look at the lights, and well, they are lights and they do reflect as they're supposed to. They are noisy, incredibly noisy, in a way that Stencil Shadows never were, to the point where it's distracting on the entire scene. When they shine into the puddles like this circumstance, they are far too bright for what they're supposed to be. The lights in Cyberpunk, even more than in stencil shaded games, look artificial and unnatural. Everything looks too bright, and the overall wetness on the surfaces is flat out unrealistic and crazy to an extent. This being used to showcase the technology, them essentially saying, hey, look, we can look back behind us, as if they couldn't have done that by placing a camera and simply using that like they do even in this specific game with the mirrors. That's how they get the mirrors working on things like the PS4 on the original release. This very game can implement that technique, but they didn't, because that technique requires effort. And that's why ray tracing is being used, because effort is not. In a time when development budgets are higher than ever, Doom 3 was developed on $10 million. Half-Life and Final Fantasy were developed on under $40 million. This game was developed on $500 million, and still released a broken mess, relying on cheap shortcuts like they use here. Now, this is a video, not about effort, not about budget, but about Stencil Shadows. So what I said might seem like an unwarranted diatribe, but in fact it is quite important to the reason that Stencil Shadows were phased out. Stencil Shadows functioned best, at least for the majority of the games that are released, if you want a realistic art style in a game such as Fear, as a supplement, where you use baked lighting in combination with Stencil Shadows that goes on top of the baked lighting to give it a shade. This worked fantastic in games like Fear, and makes it a beautiful game even to this day. But this had a cost, cost on the developers and a cost on the time to bake the levels and set them up, and then more complexity on top of making the engine already. So they said, we don't give a shit, we don't want to. And ultimately it was phased out in favor of SSR, which, despite all of its problems, essentially ends up doing the same thing, but in a worse way, making it so that the scene relies on no information, leaving parts of the screen, mainly the corners, with nothing. Now, if you were able to pull SSR back behind the player, for example, a first-person game, putting it about 10 feet behind the player, or a third-person game, instead of having the camera 10 feet and the SSR 10 feet, had the camera 10 feet and the SSR 20 feet, would make way more sense, but was simply never implemented. The problem there would be having things like walls in the way, but reflections, and instead of pure blacks, having something at least to show. This became the method that they used, because you could get a building to show off of a puddle without having to manually place a camera there and render the building. As you'll see with things like rear view cameras or mirrors in a game like Forza Horizon. So this was phased out, SSR replaced it, ray tracing replaced that, path tracing replaced that, each time the technology not being ready for the advancement, getting so bad to the point where RTX had to be supplemented by DLSS, the joke being that the 2080 Ti was a 4K card without ray tracing and a 1080p card with.